From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Inside Politics from Please Explain. I'm Jacqueline Maley. It's Friday, December 8. The pundits are calling it a political crisis, the first real crisis of the Albanese government.
A shocking 3+ weeks for the PM and his ministers on that.
Support for Anthony Albanese is deteriorating. A new poll revealing swing voters believe the Prime Minister is weak.
This week, the government really struggled to manage its response to the High Court's landmark November ruling that indefinite detention is illegal. As a result of the decision, about 150 non-citizens have been released from custody, and this week it emerged that 4 of them have allegedly reoffended since their release. This includes a former detainee and a convicted multiple rapist who was arrested on an indecent assault charge, and another man who is a registered sex offender who was arrested on charges of contacting a child online. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and Home Affairs Minister Clare O'Neil had assured the community that they were doing everything to keep people safe. The opposition called for the resignation of O'Neil and Immigration Minister Andrew Giles.
Minister, in light of these further revelations, will the Prime Minister show some strength and sack Ministers Giles and O'Neil, who created this situation through their own incompetence?
Meanwhile, the government rushed through legislation which would allow the government to refer serious offenders to judges for redetention. So how badly have Albanese and his ministers been damaged by this debacle? And does the mismanagement of this issue indicate broader incompetence within the government as it reaches the midpoint of its term? Here to flesh out these issues, we have Chief Political Correspondent David Crowe and National Affairs Editor James Massola. David, I'll start with you because we've covered this issue on the podcast already, but just quickly for those who are not following too closely, can you give us a basic rundown of what has happened with these released detainees? Who are they? Why were they released? And how many of them are there? And why can't they be deported to their home countries?
Well, it's 4 weeks since the High Court decision on indefinite detention, and that has totally changed how the government responds to this problem after decades of, holding people in indefinite detention when they are non-citizens, they've been found guilty of crimes, and they're subject to deportation. The government now has to find a different approach. It can't keep them in indefinite detention. It has to release at least some of them. And about 150 of them have been released in the wake of that High Court decision. Now, these are people who are still subject to the rule of law. They cannot be detained in a way that just punishes them for crimes they've already done time for. So this vexed problem has continued for weeks. We saw on Wednesday night the passage of law to try and deal with the problem, but the government's under pressure because there are 4 detainees who've been released who've then reoffended. They've been arrested. So this is becoming very real for the government because you've got people out in the community and you've got a valid concern about community safety. So the government's been responding to that problem. They now have a law. The question is whether that law that's now in place is going to do enough to deal with the actual problem in the real world, but also get on top of the political problem the government has on this front.
And James, you've also been in Canberra in Parliament this week watching as the government pushed through this legislation to respond to the High Court ruling. Just quickly, what will the legislation do to fix the problem?
The laws will allow the government, or in fact the Minister for Immigration, to apply for a judge to rule that a person who is judged to be a serious risk of committing either a violent offence or a sexual offence to be re-detained by the police of a particular state or territory to stop that sort of thing occurring again, Jackie.
So basically, they'll be able to draw up a list of detainees who are at risk of reoffending in a serious way and refer them to a judge who may or may not decide to re-detain them on the grounds of whether or not they're a risk to public safety.
Yeah, look, that's right. And Andrew Giles, Clare O'Neil and Mark Dreyfus held a press conference about these laws and another separate set of laws they're trying to push through by the end of the week, which they will push through by the end of the week, on being able to strip people of Australian citizenship if they're dual nationals. What Andrew Giles, the Minister for Immigration, wouldn't say was how many people would be subject to this law, how many applications would be made, essentially. He was asked again and again about this. he wouldn't go near it.
Will you release a list of how many and what offences are among the cohort that has been released today?
Claire, as you said, we did provide information to the opposition following their request. As you also identified, there are difficulties in some instances with providing detailed information for the reasons you've identified. We've got to get the balance right between providing information to the community whilst not particularly prejudicing other legal responsibilities or other causes of action.
I think the reality is of the 148 people who are in the community at the moment, probably only a handful of them, maybe 10, 15, 20, something like that, will actually be subject to an application to immediately be re-detained. But as we see with 4 people already having committed, from a sort of a spectrum of low to high range offences, there is some risk to the community and these laws are needed.
Yeah. We should point out as well that the detainees are entitled to the rule of law like Australian citizens are, and that violent and serious offenders are released from regular prison all the time with no controls against them reoffending. They just happen to be Australian citizens.
Yeah, but it's interesting, Jackie. Mark Dreyfus was asked about this by one of the journalists at the press conference, Mark Riley from Channel 7. He said, essentially, are you setting up two kinds of law here? Or two standards, if you like, different standards for citizens and non-citizens? And he weaved around the question for a while, but eventually he kind of copped to it and said, yeah, we are.
They don't have a visa. We're treating them differently to Australian citizens on the basis that they don't have a visa.
And they are different because they are people who do not have a visa. They are non-citizens, and they have all, at this point, been determined to be people who should be removed from Australia.
That's right.
That makes them a very different category of people from Australian citizens who, of course, cannot be removed from Australia.
Thank you.
I mean, there's the sort of legals of it and I suppose the human rights aspect to it, and then there's the political optics and what the public might demand. David, the government has assured us that the public would be safe, but as we've just heard, they haven't been upfront about the number of detainees who might be subject to these new laws. What's your assessment of how in control and competent the government's response has been overall and how transparent it's been this week?
Not transparent enough, and I think too passive. And the reason I say that is that we tend to find out almost by accident what the latest situation is. When detainees were released, there were about 81 released. It's now about 150. James mentioned that figure of 148. We can't really be sure whether some others have been released in the meantime since the last update. Well, in fact, that's the wrong way to put it. There's not really an update. There's not really information coming from the government in an orderly way every day about who's being released. They don't say who these individuals are. There are privacy concerns, but we don't even know the number with reliability day by day, and we certainly don't know the range of offences here. Andrew Giles, the Immigration Minister, was asked this week, how many of these individuals do you think you will then seek to detain again using the new power? And he won't make any remark upon that. So we don't know how many may go back into detention. In Andrew Giles's defence, he's got to be very careful because he's going to be arguing these issues before a judge. So he can't do something that's going to prejudice those hearings. He wants to make sure that he is on a very strong legal footing, given that they're dealing with the aftermath of this High Court decision.
But I can't imagine why naming the number of people who might be subject to these laws would be in any way prejudicial before a court.
Yeah, just the number itself.
Yeah.
And so this is an example of the way in which they just don't want it covered much. They don't want it talked about much. They don't want detail actually out there. And this will be a challenge for them. I watched the passage of the bill on Wednesday night and I was really struck by the way they just didn't want to debate it. It's a Labor bill. They've just passed significant migration amendments. And they put out a press release after the fact to say, yes, we've got our way. But they didn't want to debate in Parliament. They don't look particularly proud of this bill. That would be my verdict on it at the moment.
James, this is very much fertile ground for the opposition. It's very safe ground for the opposition. And Peter Dutton, it's almost sort of like a perfect gift for him. He's a former Home Affairs Minister. He's notoriously sort of tough on crime, tough on asylum seekers, and he's always sort of in fact, linked the danger of certain asylum seekers with the danger that they might be sex predators or sex offenders. And here we have all of those things coming together in sort of a perfect political storm for him. So can you just talk us through the opposition's response? He said, that the government's rattled, the wheels are coming off, the Prime Minister is weak and woke. How's he going with all this?
I think you've pretty much covered it all there, Jackie.
Sorry. You'll take that as a comment?
Yeah, I'll take that as a comment. No, look, that's an excellent summary, Jackie. For Peter Dutton, this is a sort of dream political moment, if you like. It's as terrible as that sounds, because this does play to his strengths. It plays to the coalition's strengths. It has put political debate very firmly in the frame of who do you trust to keep Australians safe, to keep our borders secure. This has been a vexed issue for the Labor Party for more than 2 decades, going at least back to the Tampa affair in 2001 and arguably further back than that. So while the coalition, I believe, in some respects has made very reasonable points about protecting borders and protecting communities and who are these people, and, the government needs to be more transparent, and the High Court, has made this ruling, but why did you release all these people so quickly? The government's riposte to that, of course, is because, we have to follow the rule of law. It has been also a sort of a perfect political moment in which the opposition has been able to shift the goalpost repeatedly and say, okay, well, that's your legislation. We think you should go further on this. We think you should go further on that. We've seen that time and time again. Labor on Wednesday night didn't want to talk about the legislation too much, didn't want to kind of run a victory lap, if you like, because they know that this is difficult political ground for them. And no matter what they do, they'll be outflanked by the coalition. And therefore, I guess that's why they don't want to take the victory lap.
The thing that jars with me about that whole attitude is that it's just cynical politics, isn't it? Let's not talk about it too much because we don't want the community being too aware of what's happening here. But Labor's in government now. They have to own it. They're getting on with the law. It's their law. They should be more on the front foot, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right, David. They just want to shut it down, basically. They don't want to talk about it. If you think back to the 2015 Labor Party conference where Bill Shorten led the Labor Party to finally support boat turnbacks, he owned it. That's not happening here.
James, putting aside this very destructive problem of the released detainees and the government's response to it, would you say that the government overall is cementing itself as competent and capable in the eyes of voters?
I think the Resolve Political Monitor, which David writes every month, is a pretty reliable guide to these things. I think what we've seen over the first 18 months of the Albanese government is it cementing itself as competent and capable. And what we've seen in the last month and a half or so, Jackie, and in the most recent Resolve results, are the first signs of people questioning that, particularly on this issue in terms of, immigration, border protection. I think it's been tremendously damaging. I think this has put, I don't think it's as bad as 2009 when Chris Evans, the then Labor immigration minister, said we're ending immigration detention, and 2 months later, boats were arriving every day and did for the next 4 years. But I do think this has raised the sort of the spectre again, if you like, in voters' minds of, hang on a sec, are these guys up to it? That's where we are right now. And I think if the government doesn't take charge of this, and to David's point before, grab it and take ownership of the legislation. And I think, look, Claire O'Neill's doing a good job of that. I don't agree with Nikki Salvas that Andrew Giles needs to resign, the immigration minister, but they do need to kind of grab this with both hands and say, right, we're the government, we're going to own this, because if they don't, it will be death by 1,000 cuts.
And onto another of those possible 1,000 cuts. David, do you think that voters worried about inflation and high interest rates have faith in the Albanese government to sort of ease their stress? Or, the government has taken a lot of measures, or a number of measures, on cost of living pressures, but have they effectively communicated that to voters? Will they get credit for it, in other words?
Yeah, I don't think they're getting credit for it because they often list what they're doing and they recite the list. And I don't think that merely putting it into your sound bites is convincing enough? It's an interesting kind of question. If you say it in your radio interviews and you list your achievements and you tell people in your quick list that it's about childcare, it's about Medicare and so forth, does that really work, or is that just noise? I think that's a real challenge for them in their communications. But also people look back at what, say, was promised at the last election and they say, well, look, great, you've delivered on your election promises, but the problem's still here. Can you please do more? And that's where they're at on the cost of living. And we find in the Resolve Political Monitor, Labor's losing ground on a range of fronts. They've lost a lot of ground on national security and border security. So there is a real cost from this High Court decision and its aftermath. That's in the polls. Anthony Albanese has lost ground personally when people consider whether he's doing a poor or a good job. His net rating is now negative. We haven't seen that. He's been soaring in the polls, and now it's turning.
Just quickly to finish off, if the Albanese government is to turn its fortunes around or to sort of recover from what you might call a midterm slump, what would be the best way out considering the opponent they have in Peter Dutton? James, I'll go to you first.
I think it's easy for us to say, it maybe not so easy for the government to do. But look, I think we're at a point, Jack, where Albanese and his government need to clasp the nettle and do something bold in the same way that John Howard did heading into the 1998 election, 6 to 12 months out, and in adopting the GST. I'm not saying that it's a GST-shaped reform, but they need to do something that people can say, like what would you say? A lightning rod policy, if you like.
To show that they stand for something.
Yeah, exactly. And for me, that is adopting a limit, I think, on negative gearing, because that sends a signal to voters. We understand you. We understand that, housing is difficult to get into. It's expensive if you're renting. It's expensive if you're buying. And it goes further than what they've done so far. I think they've got the politics of housing wrong. I think the Greens are stealing a march from them. I think they're going to win inner city seats in places like Cooper and Wills in Melbourne. And I think Albo's like, well, we've got this Housing Australia Future Fund and we've got this $2 billion accelerator that if the states do this and the following, Tuesday and the Moons and the Occidental, that will mean that blah, blah, blah. I think it's garbage. I'm sure these are good policies, but I don't think they're cutting through with voters. I think they need to do something big and bold. That's what it is.
Interesting. I love a big, bold call. David?
I think they need to pick a fight. I think they need to be very cautious about what that fight is. For instance, there are calls for them to modify stage 3 tax cuts, like go on personal tax cuts. I think they are limited by what they can do because of the election promises in 2022. And I know that if you look at Anthony Albanese's track record, he believes in kicking with the wind in the final quarter. That means that the May budget may not be the moment for them to pick a big fight ahead of the next election. They may time that to be later next year, or even early in 2025, depending on the timing of that election. But that's when you might see them say, look, I know that we said in 2022 that this was our commitment in the term. Now we're telling you what our commitment is in the next term, and here is our battle plan. So I think they've still got time for that. I think they've got to really just hold their nerve at the moment. Don't get rattled by the fact that they are in a slump. And I think they've got to admit that they're performing badly, just in terms of the daily politics of communicating. I think they can be quite lazy and arrogant against their own best interests in some ways in terms of making this fight against the coalition. But there's one other thing too. Attention turns on Peter Dutton the closer we get to the next election. Not having an economic policy does not become sustainable. At some point, he has to declare where he stands. He gets subject to scrutiny. There is a cycle in politics. We're only halfway through the term. Things do change, and I think the main mission for Labor is to hold their nerve and get out there next year with a stronger message and a more compelling pitch on the cost of living.
There we go, a call for boldness in 2024 from our panellists. Thank you both very much for joining us today. David, we'll see you next week. James, I hope you have a lovely summer.
Thanks, Jack. Good to be with you.
Cheers all.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Chi Wong, with technical assistance by Debbie Harrington. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Jacqueline Maley. This is Inside Politics from Please Explain. Thanks for listening.